You pay full price for what the app calls the last seat available, and the confirmation lands on your phone before you've even put your card away. A seat number, a boarding group, your name locked to a reservation. You assume, reasonably, that somewhere inside that airplane, a physical chair now belongs to you and to no one else. Then you get to the gate and hear the announcement nobody wants to hear. The flight is oversold. The airline is asking for volunteers to give up their seats, and if not enough people raise a hand, someone is getting bumped whether they like it or not. You paid for something that, in the strictest sense, might not physically exist. That contradiction is not a mistake in the system. It is the system. Under U.S. rules, airlines can legally sell more confirmed reservations than they have seats, and Delta spells this out in plain language in its own contract with passengers. It may sell more tickets than it has room for, because confirmed travelers sometimes simply don't show up. The federal agency that regulates commercial aviation confirms the same thing from the other direction. Overselling isn't illegal. It exists specifically to offset no-shows. Not every airline uses it, and it doesn't happen on every flight, but the practice itself is built into how tickets get sold on the routes where it's used. To understand why a business would deliberately invite this kind of confrontation at the gate, you have to think about what an airline seat actually is as a product. It isn't like a jacket sitting on a shelf waiting patiently for a buyer. The moment that cabin door swings shut and the plane pushes back, every empty seat on board becomes worthless, not discounted, not carried over to tomorrow, worthless permanently for that flight. There is no clearance rack for a seat that flew empty at 30,000 feet, and there is no way to sell it again once the wheels leave the ground. That single fact reshapes the entire business. A hotel can drop its rate at the last minute and still sell a room at midnight. A retailer can mark down inventory next season. An airline gets exactly one shot at each seat, and that shot has an expiration time measured in minutes before departure. Meanwhile, some percentage of the passengers holding confirmed reservations on any given flight will cancel, rebook, or simply fail to show up, for reasons that have nothing to do with the airline. Business trips get canceled. Connections get missed. People change their minds. Every one of those no-shows leaves a seat behind that the airline already sold once and now cannot sell again in time to matter. Sell too conservatively, and those same seats fly empty for certain. Sell too aggressively, and the airline ends up paying to unwind its own mistake at the gate. So the airline faces a choice. It can sell exactly as many tickets as it has seats, except that a predictable share of them will fly empty and quietly absorb that loss every single day. Or it can study its own history, route by route, season by season, and build a forecast of how many passengers on a given flight are statistically likely to vanish before boarding. Once that forecast exists, the airline can sell a small number of additional reservations beyond its physical seat count, betting that the no-shows will make room for them. Airlines can use historical booking patterns to estimate how many confirmed passengers on a given flight are likely to cancel or fail to appear. No forecast built that way is ever perfect. Passenger behavior on any single departure can drift from an airline's own historical pattern for reasons it has no way to see coming, which is exactly why selling beyond capacity is a bet, not a guarantee. That additional capacity is not a new chair bolted onto the plane. It is a probability, sold as if it were a product. Call it a virtual seat. A real confirmed claim recorded in the airline system, with a real price attached and a real passenger's name on it, even though the carrier may have accepted more confirmed claims than the cabin can physically hold. Most of the time, this works exactly as designed. A ticketed passenger doesn't show, the extra reservation quietly slides into that empty spot, the plane leaves closer to full, and nobody on board ever learns that a bet was placed and won. This is where the picture usually stops for most travelers, and it's also exactly where it gets more interesting, because that quiet, invisible success is only half of what a virtual seat can become. Watch what happens to the same reservation when the forecast is wrong instead of right. If every single ticketed passenger actually shows up, including the people the airline predicted would cancel, there is no empty seat left to absorb the extra reservation. The virtual seat didn't require another plane, another flight, or another physical seat to sell, and it brought in real cash the moment someone bought it, even though that cash wouldn't actually become revenue until the passenger traveled. When the forecast fails instead, that same reservation turns into a liability the airline has to pay to unwind. That flip, from cash already in hand to a bill still to be paid, is the entire story compressed into one moment at the departure gate. The industry doesn't sell an extra chair. It sells a probability, and it only finds out what that probability actually cost once the gate agent finishes the final count. Once you see the seat this way, as a bet rather than a fixed object, the airline's next move makes sense. Before it can deny boarding to anyone because of an oversale, federal rules require it to try to buy the mistake back voluntarily first. A gate agent asks for volunteers and offers compensation, which may include money, vouchers, or alternate travel arrangements. If too few passengers accept, the airline may increase the offer. Some travelers take an early offer because they have nowhere urgent to be. Others wait, hoping a better one arrives before departure. Only when that voluntary market fails to clear does the airline resort to bumping someone against their will based on rules it already published, ranked by factors like check-in time, fare class, cabin, and frequent flyer status. This is the part of the system most passengers never think about until it happens to them. Two confirmed reservations on the same flight are not actually equal in practice. The traveler who checked in first, paid for a higher fare class, or holds elite status sites closer to the front of an invisible protection line. The traveler who checked in late, on the cheapest available fare, may sit lower in the airline's published boarding priority even though both of them are holding the exact same word on their boarding pass, confirmed. None of that ranking can amount to unfair discrimination under the rules the airline has on file with regulators. But within those limits, the airline sets its own order. Notice what that voluntary market really represents underneath the polite gate announcements. The airline is not simply apologizing for an error. It is discovering, seat by seat, exactly how much its own miscalculation is going to cost. Every dollar or voucher offered to a volunteer is the market price of unwinding a bet the airline placed weeks or months earlier when it decided to oversell that flight in the first place. The gate becomes a live settlement window for a wager most passengers never knew existed until the moment they were standing inside it. Scale changes how often that settlement window opens, and not always in the airline's favor. A carrier operating thousands of flights a day can build far more sophisticated forecasts than a smaller one, drawing on huge amounts of historical data about which routes, seasons, and departure times produce the most reliable no-show patterns. Better forecasting should, in theory, mean fewer expensive surprises, but scale also means the airline is placing thousands of these small bets every single day across an entire network on flights with wildly different backup options behind them. Even a very small forecasting error becomes meaningful when repeated across thousands of departures. The costs on the other side of that bet are not evenly distributed, and this is where the real financial pressure lives. If a bumped passenger's arrival is delayed by 1 to 2 hours on a covered domestic flight, federal rules require compensation equal to twice the one-way fare, capped at roughly $1,075. If the delay stretches longer than that, the required payment jumps to 4 times the fare, up to about $2,150, with some narrow exceptions built into the rule. Depending on the circumstances and the airline's policies, the carrier may also incur rebooking, hotel, meal, and customer service costs. Those expenses must be weighed against the additional revenue the oversale was intended to preserve. This is precisely why real-world results vary so dramatically between airlines running the exact same basic business model. Government data covering all of 2025 shows more than 290,000 passengers across the reporting airlines volunteered to give up their seats in exchange for compensation, against fewer than 25,000 who were bumped involuntarily. That means roughly 9 out of every 10 cases resolved through negotiation rather than force, across an industry that boarded close to 900 million passengers that year. These figures come from data that covered airlines are required to report quarterly to the U.S. Department of Transportation, but averages hide enormous gaps underneath them. The Delta network reported more than 126,000 voluntary denied boardings in 2025 and 0 involuntary denied boardings. Frontier Airlines, by contrast, told a different story with the same basic strategy. It reported just over 2,000 volunteers but more than 8,000 involuntary denials that same year, a rate of roughly 2.5 bumped passengers for every 10,000 who flew with them. That gap is not simple proof that one airline forecasts better than the other, and the honest version of this story has to admit that up front. Network size, route mix, how many backup flights exist on a given day, and how aggressively each airline prices its voluntary offers all shape that number too, not forecasting skill alone. A carrier with dozens of daily flights between two major cities can slot a bumped passenger onto the next departure within the hour. All else equal, having more same-day alternatives can reduce the cost and disruption of reaccommodating a passenger. A carrier flying a route once a day has almost nowhere to put that same passenger, so it has every incentive to avoid oversell errors on that flight in the first place, or to pay generously and early to avoid a forced bump entirely. The virtual seat is the same idea everywhere. What it costs to unwind depends entirely on how much flexibility surrounds it, which is why the exact same overbooking formula can look generous on a hub route and look reckless on a route with only one flight a day. Neither pattern is inherently right or wrong on its own. Each one reflects a different bet, sized to a different network. It also helps to remember that this entire mechanism operates inside a system that is nowhere close to permanently overbooked. System-wide passenger load factor, a seat-mile utilization measure that compares miles actually flown by paying passengers against miles of seats made available, ran at roughly 82% over the 12 months ending in the spring of 2026. That average shows the industry as a whole isn't flying above its means, but it can't tell you which individual flights were oversold and which weren't. It's a system-wide measure, not a flight-by-flight one. Overbooking is a targeted tool aimed at specific routes and specific departure times where the airline's own history says the no-show pattern is reliable enough to bet on, not a blanket policy applied to every seat on every plane in the fleet. None of this is guesswork dressed up as a business strategy. The underlying math has academic roots going back decades. An early model built specifically to test airline overbooking against real-world cancellation and no-show patterns found that in its own illustrative examples. Properly accounting for those cancellations could lift revenue by up to roughly 9% compared with a model that ignored those effects entirely. That number describes one historical academic exercise, not a promise about what any airline earns today, but it captures the underlying logic well. Ignore the no-show pattern entirely, and you leave real money in seats that fly empty for no reason. Account for it, and you recover a meaningful share of that lost revenue, as long as your model for predicting no-shows is actually accurate. The specific number is decades old, but the same basic expected value calculation still sits underneath modern airline revenue management, now running on far more data than existed when that original model was built. That last condition is where everything either holds together or falls apart, so it's worth walking through what the airline is really weighing every time it decides how far above capacity to sell a given flight. Picture a single flight, purely as an illustration, with a handful of extra reservations sold beyond the physical seat count. If the airline's history says a certain share of ticketed passengers on that route reliably fail to show, then selling that same number of extra seats should, on average, convert seats that would have flown empty into seats that generate real fare revenue instead, without needing another plane, another flight, or another physical seat to do it. That's the entire upside in one sentence. The downside only shows up on the days when the forecast misses, when the no-shows don't materialize, and the airline has to spend real money buying back exactly the number of extra reservations it can't seat. On one side of the ledger sits the expected revenue from those extra seats, multiplied by the odds the forecast holds. On the other side sits the expected cost of the mistake, rising voucher offers, mandated compensation, hotel rooms, and goodwill damage if volunteers don't come forward fast enough. The airline doesn't need to win that bet every time. It only needs the math to work out in its favor across thousands of flights, often enough and by a wide enough margin that the wins outweigh the losses. Run the exact same oversold flight forward twice, on the exact same route. Sold using the exact same forecast. In the version where things go well, the no-shows land close to what the model predicted. The extra reservations slide quietly into seats that would otherwise have flown empty, and nobody gets bumped. Passengers walk on board with confirmed seats, unaware that any of this ever happened, because from where they're sitting, nothing did. For the airline, it's a quiet win. One more line in a much larger ledger of departures that day. Now rerun it on a route that doesn't have much slack to absorb an error. More passengers show up than expected on a flight where the next available departure isn't until tomorrow morning. The first round of volunteer offers doesn't produce enough takers, so the airline raises the offer and raises it again, burning cash and time it never budgeted for. Eventually, it runs out of volunteers and has to bump someone against their will, potentially triggering mandatory compensation, as well as additional rebooking or accommodation costs. On a route with almost no backup capacity, a handful of unlucky forecasting misses in the same season can quickly erode the revenue gains the strategy produced on quieter days. The difference between those two outcomes rarely comes down to one dramatic failure. It can emerge instead when several ordinary variables drift in the wrong direction at once. A holiday weekend where fewer people than usual change their plans. A weather delay somewhere else in the network that suddenly makes every seat on your flight precious to a stranded traveler trying to get home. A route that just lost its evening backup flight to a schedule change made months earlier for entirely unrelated reasons. A short fare sale that briefly changes who books the flight before the forecast has time to catch up. None of those factors on their own would break the model. Stacked together on the same afternoon, they're enough to turn a quiet, invisible bet into a very visible, very expensive one at the gate. So think back to that confirmation on your phone, the seat number and boarding group that arrived the instant you paid. Under the rules airlines operate by, that confirmation is real. It creates confirmed, reserved space, a genuine claim on that flight, not an empty gesture. What it doesn't create on the days when confirmed claims add up to more than the cabin can hold is a second physical seat to match. Most of the time, that distinction never matters because the prediction behind your reservation holds and the flight fills exactly the way the airline expected. Every so often, the prediction breaks, and the gap between a confirmed claim and physical capacity can suddenly become an expensive operational problem. The airline never actually built an extra chair. It simply decided that the risk of that gap opening up was worth selling anyway.